My name is Johannes Silje. I'm a policy fellow at das Progressive Zentrum in Berlin. And I have the honor to be a chair in this short but certainly intense session of the Progressive Governance Summit, in which we will take a close look at the far right and populist and also nationalist actors and their strategies to gain support during the pandemic, but also the time ahead of us. And of course, we will also look at what progressive parties should do about that. So let me warmly welcome my two very distinguished panelists, Catherine de Vries and Cas Mudde, who both belong to the top class of international academics on our subject. Catherine de Vries is a professor of political science in Milano in Italy. She's an expert on European politics with a focus on Euroscepticism, and her most recent book is called Political Entrepreneurs, the Rise of Challenger Parties in Europe. Welcome to you, Catherine. And then we have Cas Mudde, who is one of the most influential scholars of populism and the far right. And I think there's almost no academic book on populism from the past 10 years which does not include his definition of populism. Cas is a professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia in the US. I think the list of books is way too long to tell you all of that now, but one of his most recent books in German, at least, is called Rechtsaußen, and it was published by the Dietz Verlag. So welcome to you, Cas, and I'm really, really glad to have you here both. So we have actually very limited time, so let's dive directly in our topic, and I have to ask you to be brief in your answers so that we manage to cover a couple of areas during our talk. Catherine, let's start with you. If we go 1 year back from today and remember the sort of competing narratives on right-wing populism and the pandemic that were around last year, some people said that this pandemic is a sort of nationalist moment because borders were shut down, even within the Schengen area, and people's orientation went towards the national state. I think we can say that. So something that the far right actually could claim as their vision becoming reality. But others argued in such a fundamental crisis, people rather turn to the established parties, and this could weaken the populists. Of course, there's no one-dimensional answer to that, but could you please give us an idea of how the reactions of right-wing populists to this pandemic looked like, and how these strategies were perceived by the different publics in the respective countries?
Yeah, thank you very much, Johannes. It's also great to be here today and to talk about these important issues. So I think that what you saw in the media was prior to the pandemic, it was, well, every election is going to be won by a right-wing populist. And then during the pandemic, it was, oh, now right-wing populism is on its decline for X number of years, right? So we go from one extreme to the other extreme. So I think the issue is often that it is much more nuanced. I think what you described of those two visions, that they can apply to different cases, and they work in different circumstances. I can just kind of allude a little bit to some things that we saw. So initially, when the crisis hit, I will focus now particularly on Europe, you saw kind of a rally around the flag. So you did see that government parties actually did well. And that was probably because in a time of crisis where people don't really know what to think, they want, their ICU beds, they want to have their ventilators, they want kind of governance to be there. Then, of course, you saw differences in the responses. So certain governments were better at curbing the pandemic than others, and you saw that reflected in their popularity. And then what you see now as we're moving in vaccinations, also the backlash against vaccinations in some European countries, but now as we're moving out, you see actually a lot of the issues that were there coming up again. So I think the issue sometimes in how we talk about populism is that there is a demand for far right or populist right parties. And that demand can fluctuate with kind of current conditions. When there are a lot of boats entering Italy, for example, that kind of features the agenda, and then you see a spark off again. You see that now, for example, with the technocratic Draghi government, the far-right party, Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, being outside, and they are less able to control the agenda, but they also seem like the real opposition vis-a-vis a kind of unity government. So I think it really was that in the pandemic, a lot of the issues like immigration and so on were off the agenda for a little bit. That made it more difficult for populist parties to then, capitalize on that. But as we're now moving out, we're going back to kind of, a lot of discussions on immigration already happening in Southern Europe. We're talking about economic recovery. We're talking about unemployment. The real kind of, lifting of the support is going to happen now. So I think a lot of that demand is still there. And therefore, I would see that, especially in countries that have been hard hit and where the economic shock will be quite considerable, and there will be a delayed move into kind of normality, you're going to see a lot of those things coming back. So I think the ideas really need to be that, this is populism or the strength of far-right parties, we might want to talk about concepts, but I'll leave it here, really varies with kind of current conditions. And I think that just shows you that far-right parties have become part and parcel of domestic debates and of domestic politics, and they can wane and grow depending on the opportunities that are there and that they're able to capitalize on.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Cas, you can certainly bring in also the US perspective to this question. And of course, we all remember that actually in the US, there was an election in the midst of this pandemic. So let me put this question as follows. Do you think the pandemic and the handling of the pandemic by Donald Trump is rather an explanation for his defeat or rather an explanation for his relative success in this election because his actual result was not that bad?
Yeah, even though it sounds weird, like you can also say both. And you have to keep in mind that in the US, 1-2% mean everything, which actually in most European systems is not the case. And so yes, probably it played a role in this defeat, but because the defeat was so narrow, like almost everything, including the weather, played a role. And what we did see in polls was that a specific demographic, older white people, which traditionally vote for Republican Party, were very skeptical about his approach because, of course, they were particularly affected by COVID. I mean, they died the most, and they vote on the basis of what's good for them. So in that sense, yeah, that was bad. On the other hand, it attracted also a lot of people, including parts of the Hispanic community, which got very hard hit by the pandemic socioeconomically and wanted to reopen, right? So I think that in that sense, the US is a very, very different country than most European countries, particularly in terms of so-called liberty. I just wanted to respond to the question before. I think one of the important parts was that it wasn't just that immigration was off the agenda, but actually the borders were closed, right? And so the key policy of the far right, the key solution to everything is pretty much just closing the borders, right? Now, the big problem, though, that we might have is that we kind of all agree that that helped. And what the far right has been doing over the last year is saying, look, they've always said we can't close the borders. It's disastrous, right? And now we all did it. And look, it could be done and it did work. And I think this is a narrative that we are going to see with the far right, that and the mainstream parties have to come up with an argument. Like, so why did it work? And like, why shouldn't we do it the next time? Because the simple argument of, well, we can't do that, like that won't fly in the coming months.
Cas, let's stay for one moment at the crisis management by government. And I want to give you another question on that, because I think it's pretty clear that when we discuss the influence of the far right and populist parties, then it's not enough to look only at them and their electoral results. We also need to look at the other parties and in particular to what extent they adopt the agenda of the far right and of populists. And you just talked about the closure of the border. So my question is, when you look at the crisis management of progressive and also conservative governments, did you see any kind of mainstreaming of the far right or the populist agenda in the reaction of governments to this pandemic?
No, I would say compared to particularly the painful response to the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-16, not really that much. Although governments close to borders, they didn't necessarily use very nativist arguments. Unlike here, for example, where Trump went on about the Chinese flu and the Kung flu and all those kind of racist things. It was a very matter-of-factual kind of managerial closing of the borders and the argument behind it. I think overall the discourse hasn't been particularly nativist. It has been a bit, let's say, national priority oriented. I mean, particularly in the first wave, many of the governments in the end looked for a national response rather than a European response, right? And that, of course, again, played into, like, in the end, we are more Dutch than European, or we're more French than European, which is, of course, the whole narrative of nationalism, of the far right. But I definitely didn't see a particularly nativist argumentation for European responses.
Right. Our time is short, so I would like to move on already now on today's situation. And Catherine, if we look at the situation now in many of the Western countries, the pandemic is more and more under control. That means that other issues than the actual health crisis will come up on the agenda. You just talked about the issues that were actually pushed from the agenda during the crisis. So now maybe some of them will come back to the agenda. And some of them will certainly be still related to the pandemic, for instance, the economic and social damages that it has created. But the question is, what will the far right and what will populist forces campaign on next? If you, for example, look at the AfD in Germany, they believe that the post-COVID economic crisis could help them to mobilize the economic anxieties of people. But actually, when you look at what competences the people see in this party, then it's actually not economic policies. So, Catherine, what do you think? What could be the big issues of this party in the near future? And what are the issues that the other parties, the progressive and maybe also conservative ones, should be particularly afraid of?
So I think you saw already a little bit, as you know, when the US and the UK were getting ahead on vaccinations, that you saw a lot of populist right, far right parties advocating lifting and being quicker and like anti-lockdown. You saw that also. I mean, it was in Italy, you saw it in the Netherlands, you saw it also in different countries, right? So they're losing a bit of that issue. So especially, for example, Forum for Democracy in the Netherlands won quite a lot of seats in the national elections on this kind of platform of, you know, they've taken our freedom away kind of element, right? So and this is too much. So they're losing that a little bit. I disagree a little bit with Kos on the borders, because the border stuff works in the Netherlands, but it doesn't work so well in bigger countries because the internal regional borders were also closed. So in that way, actually, a lot of people didn't like that the borders was closed. So it depends a little bit on the country. So the question is a little bit, how much can we kind of mobilize that border? On the specific question on that economic issue, I mean, the evidence suggests that a prolonged economic crisis is exactly something that you could exploit, right? Note that also other elements like rising prices. So usually these are not kind of financial crises, but crises that come endogenous out of the economy and lead to levels of, for example, price increasement or big job loss. That would be the case. But interestingly, the empirical evidence is not 100% sure on that. Actually, the one thing that seems to be that the empirical evidence on the economic origins shows is that austerity is a big driving force in kind of the development of the far right. We've seen that work in the UK. We've seen work actually also on historically on Germany and reanalysis of the rise of the Nazi Party, showing that austerity was kind of key. And I think in that way, it's interesting thinking about this crisis vis-a-vis 2010. You know, I'm Dutch by origin, so the Dutch government wanted to turn this into a 2010 crisis in Europe, right? This was about high indebtedness in the South, and we're not going to be solidaric, but ultimately, the Next Generation EU and the packages coming out of the EU have been more generous towards the South, especially. And that, I think, might change a little bit. But I do have to say, it really will be, you know, the proof will be in the pudding as we're lifting all this, you know, short employment support and support for companies. We don't really know what the exact fallout would be. So economic uncertainty and perhaps economic decline is something that basically these parties can galvanize on. But I think especially what you're seeing in countries that I know well in the south of Europe, so you see it in Spain, you see it in Italy, that already the influx of immigration seems to be already something that's mobilized both by Brothers of Italy in Italy and also Vox in Spain, as there are, you know, and that is, of course, also when we think about that the vaccine rollout is very slow. You know, we think the pandemic is kind of over, but, you know, for most parts of the world, that's not the case. So there might be fluctuations. And then you get the element, and maybe Kos can talk about it as well, about foreigners bringing diseases. And then, you know, then you can think about a different element. I mean, actually, to be fair, the only one who I heard saying that was actually Sebastian Kurz in Austria. He's made some of these remarks. Not necessarily, well, we can think about how we classify him and his positions at the moment, but, you know, that could be, of course, also a breeding ground. So I think economic uncertainty, it's too early to tell what will be the case. That can definitely be a galvanization ground, but austerity seems to have played a key role in the past, and that's less so now. But, you know, there will be a time where that comes back, especially of mainstream right, you know, talking about that already in the German context, perhaps in the Dutch context, and we'll see how that plays out. So I think both economically, but I think we should also not underestimate, you know, pressures of migration flows and that kind of elements and how they will play out in the reconfiguration programmatically of some of these parties.
Let's stay for one moment at these economic dimension, and I want to give this question to Kos, and it actually it's a direct follow-up to what you just said, Kos. You said that austerity was a driver for populists and the far right in the past, and this is connected, I would say, to the financial crisis and also to the policies imposed by the European Union on some of the southern countries within the EU. Now we see a different response by the European Union to this crisis. Let's put it easy. There's not that much of austerity policy, but there's another way. There is the strategy of taking common debt and giving grants to one of the most affected countries by the pandemic. And this is actually something that is very much welcomed in the southern countries. But there is, you could say, increasing protest in the rather northern and rather rich countries by the respective populist parties in that countries. So, Kos, my question to you is, could it be a sort of different geographical effect this time, that the response of the European Union could rather create a sort of positive effect for the populist parties in the sort of northern part of the European Union?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, that was the case, of course, already during the Great Recession, right? I mean, you saw mostly left populist response in the South initially, right populist response in the North, and then kind of after the austerity came a bigger wave of right-wing populism. So first of all, I think it's important that we should make policies on the basis of whether or not populists might use them. We should make policies on the basis of what we think is best, and we should do it from our own agenda, and that undermines actually the far right. If we do it from this perspective of that we play into them and take away some of their points, they will come up with other points, or they will just become more radical. I do believe that what is important and what I worry about is the first response was not austerity, right? Well, the first response in the North, as Catherine said, of course, in our country was austerity, but they couldn't push it through. Now, although it was not as generous as the right makes it out to be, there was this kind of European solidarity. You now also see a discourse, particularly in the center-right and the right-wing parties, mainstream right-wing parties, of okay, we have spent and now we should go back. I think that will be disastrous. Like if you by and large, then it looks as if you first gave away much money to the South, and now we'll take all the money from the North. I think if we continue with this policy that is state-oriented, right, because the state is now back as a problem solver rather than the reason of our problems, and which actually redistributes and invests in national economies, then European solidarity will be less problematic. Of course, right-wing populists are going to try and use it, but I don't think it will stick in the same way. But as said, what my big worry is that very quickly now we're going to pretty much cut all of the socioeconomic support that we have had during the pandemic, and we're going to have some kind of softer austerity than in 2010, and that will be perfect for the far right to say, you see, there was money for others, right, when they wanted it, but when we want it, it's not there.
Catherine, how would you answer this question for the context of the European Union? You actually started this argument a little bit in your last answer, and when you talked about the austerity policies some years ago, and now we have quite a different reaction of the European Union towards this crisis. What's your hunch? How could this play out in the different countries, in the different regions of Europe in terms of the reactions and maybe also the benefits of populist parties on this particular crisis reaction now of the European countries?
Yeah, just to kind of first already follow up on something that I think Cos very rightly pointed out about the fact that, populist parties might come up with something different. I mean, you saw it very clearly, right, here in Italy, where, especially someone like Matteo Salvini of Lega, of the League, has always been very kind of anti-EU and so on like that. And of course, he greeted the recovery fund, and it was very until he finds something else, right? So it's very strategic and very quick. These positions might change. I think what you're seeing, especially in a country like, let me just kind of answer that question on the basis of Italy, where you see that the bloc of the right and of the far right, which, Lega has a part that's very far right, a part that's more conservative right, I would think will qualify it like that. And that's also has always been a struggle for Salvini to control, that he's kind of moving down, but that sentiment is still there and is now being served by Meloni, by the leader of Brothers of Italy. And she has a much more consistent view on European integration, as this needs to be renationalized, re-sovereignty. So in that way, that links to the issue of borders that we talked about before, that would be more in line with how she would see it. So it's fine to give Italy money, but she still is kind of criticizing the attachments of reforms that are associated with that, right? So I have the feeling that also, if you talk in Brussels circles, that the expectations are very high about this, probably too high, right? And then what you also see is that, of course, far-right parties feel that some of this is moving away, an issue that they've been that they've been kind of antagonizing against, and then they try to find a different angle of doing this. And this reclaiming of sovereignty in a kind of, and I see also a link to the kind of Brexit debate as the way Brexiteers were highlighting it. So sovereignty is, my country is in control of making laws, very different than sovereignty means that I can address problems, which would be the very famous quote of Mario Draghi, that we might need to do also internationally. They very much have this first, let's say Hobbesian even kind of sovereignty idea, right? The state Leviathan is totally in control. And that fits also the kind of the movement towards, investing more from the state and so on like that. So that could be more popular. I think that is an undercurrent that we're not seeing. And that in the EU, I think people are just viewing this very much, this is, we've given this, they're going to reform, they're going to grow, and that's it. I'm making a big platitude now, right? But it's very complex. And I think especially this defining the state as being a core and therefore having the sovereignty. So maybe not so much the borders. I think people do see the benefits of borders, but the idea that we could renationalize some parts of the EU in a way. And there could be, you know, if you get these parties in government in some parts of the South, that fits also very much of what we see with far-right parties in power in Poland and Hungary. So I have the feeling that that is something that is going to be really important to watch in years to come.
Kas, do you want to react directly to that? Because I think this was a kind of interesting claim made by Catherine, that this sort of idea that it's better to re-nationalize some kind of policies within the European Union might be something that people might have realized during this pandemic, and this could be something that the nationalists and the far right picks up and campaign on. Would you agree with that? And which policy areas could that be?
Well, I think what would be useful is if we would have a debate on that, and it would be a detailed debate, right? Because this is a general claim of the far right. But I wonder if you push them on it and say, okay, so this policy, if we renationalize that, right? What are the consequences of that? Right? They will get stuck. I mean, I still remember that debate between Macron and Marine Le Pen in between the two rounds of the 2017 presidential election, when she came with this really bizarre kind of offhand plan of having two currencies, right? One for the people, the reintroduced French franc, and one for big business, the euro. And she got completely lost in the details, because at this stage, everything is so intertangled that it's incredibly hard to renationalize one field without having like spillover into other fields, right? And so I think that this is a debate that we should actually have rather than run away from, because it is on the agenda. And for many people, they feel like, yeah, the EU doesn't do this well, so why not bring it back? Now, in certain cases, you can bring it back. You might not want to, but you can. In others, you cannot do that without bringing back all kinds of other things as well, for which there's no support. But we have been running away from these types of debates, and that strengthens them, right? And I think that's important. On the other hand, I also think that, particularly in the second wave, the EU has kind of showed that there is a benefit to working together, like with regard to vaccines and everything. Unfortunately, this is done within the larger ideological narrative of national interest, because the first wave was very much about we should take care of ourselves, right? And to get out of that narrative, right, by just saying, well, the EU worked, right? That doesn't work that well. And so as I've argued also in my written piece, right, you cannot detach your policies from your overall narrative, right? The ideological narrative places and makes people evaluate your argument. And I think in that sense, we come out of this pandemic with more focus on national, of both the state and national, but the national state rather than the European Union. And that is what parties have to think about. How do we explain that our national interests are being taken care of in collaboration? And that is not just saying, well, look, the EU did well on this one vaccine thing, right? This is a broader story that you need to tell. And again, we have been walking away from these type of ideological conversations.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great bridge towards our last chapter that we have to enter already now. I'd like to look at how progressive parties can prepare for the strategies of the far right tomorrow. Many in our audience might be particularly interested in the cases of Germany and France because of the upcoming elections. Catherine, let's start with Germany. In Germany, the Green Party stands a good chance to be part of the next government. Already now, in the ongoing campaign, we can see that the Green leader, the Green candidate, Annalena Baerbock, is kind of the new Angela Merkel for the far right in terms of constructing an enemy, as basically she's the top enemy now in their campaign. And if the Greens do enter the government, and if they want to implement their ecological agenda, they will need to have a strategy on how to avoid something like a Gilets jaunes movement that we have seen in France. So from your perspective, how should the Greens prepare for such a negative and anti-campaign against their transformative agenda?
Yes, it's a great question. I can also not 100%, give the answer to that. I would be trying to advise parties on how to do that. But I think what's important is exactly what, I couldn't agree more with Gus, in the sense that we've been, depoliticizing certain debates just doesn't work, because basically you're seen as complicit to all kinds of things, right? So when it comes to the EU or when it comes to other things. So I think clear position taking, which I have to say the Greens in Germany have throughout actually done quite well, especially I think I would have to say post Joschka Fischer again, because he started to maybe, governmentize the party a little bit more again. But she's nonetheless, of course, also a realistic, or real, or how we would say, like a realistic Green. I think this kind of connection in the way that, so I do, I've always made a difference between what indeed far-right parties say politically and issue-wise, which I agree with Kos. When you press them very hard, they get usually into trouble on certain elements. The question is, does everyone care about that? But nonetheless, some people will care about that, versus their kind of very good style that they also provide, which is very, very, very much the case in the way they use also, especially, in this country, in Italy, social media, and then they're very versed in doing campaigning. So I think on the issue side, you just have to be very clear and outline these things and outline the different types of debates. And then I think for a Green party or for a progressive party, it has to be a clear element of like, what's the, it's not about neoliberal market liberalization. That is, the claiming of globalization by the FT as a certain kind of element is not what globalization only means to be. The fact that I can live in a different country, the fact that Kos can live in a different country where he was born in, and we can work there and we can share and we can marry different people from different countries. I see that as a benefit, right? And that's a benefit that we can talk about. Maybe not everybody thinks about that as a benefit, but just talk a little bit about that. I was just struck again on the discussions about the Euro Cup, the football, like, how would our teams look like without this level of free movement of people and people moving around and much more diverse? So I think this kind of commitment to, what you want and what your vision is. And then also just, I would say, allowing yourself to be the anti-side of that far-right mobilization can be beneficial. One small caveat on that, you saw that in the Dutch election, where some of the more, very kind of pro-progressive parties did well, also particularly the leader of D66. She's a person who cares very much about human rights, is married to a Palestinian, has been very explicit about these things. But then in the coalition negotiations, which are very complicated, she went very quickly back to mainstream politics. And I think that is where voters are like, oh, I smell you bluff now. This was nice in the campaign, but you're not really committed to this. And I think a lot of the time on the far right, there's less people who have the idea that they have a commitment problem. These guys have commitment problems. We see them switching around all the time, but they're very good at, in their style and their rhetoric, and choosing, to go into government or not, or with whom to go into government, to display that. And I think, to display that less of a commitment problem. I understand that for mainstream parties it's very difficult because you also want to govern the country. But I think you have to be very clear. This is my vision. This is the style, how I outline that. And these are only the conditions under which I actually am going to go into government under certain circumstances. And this always appeasing everything to every extent, where at a certain point, not much is left anymore. I think that time, in my opinion, is over.
Because let's stay for one more moment in Germany and at the situation here just before the federal elections. The agenda of the Green Party, but also of the Social Democrats, one could say, is a transformative agenda. It's about a social, ecological transformation, which goes directly at the heart of people's lifestyles and also cultural behaviors. And one of the claims that have been made for the far right is that they are quite strong on this cultural dimension of politics. So what do you think? How should the response of Greens look like if the far right in Germany, the AfD, for example, is campaigning on this cultural dimension, on the, let's say, on the claim that the Greens or other parties want to change the lifestyles of people?
Actually, the Greens have a big advantage over social democratic parties here, because the Greens profit from the social cultural dimension as the radical right do. And on top of that, they don't compete with the radical right for voters. I think, like in Saxony-Anhalt over the weekend, for example, I think if I remember correctly, you saw that no one had gone from the AfD to the Greens, right? There was a zero, whereas even to the Linke, and there are links, right? So we know that there is virtually no overlap between the potential electorates of the Greens and of the radical right, unlike with the Social Democrats, which is much smaller than the narrative has, but there is one, right? So that gives massive freedom and space for the Greens to do what they want to do. I also think overall progressive parties should start to see losses to each other as less problematic. I understand that from a professional point of view, right? It's your position, it's your job. But we're at a time in our lives where we're fighting for liberal democracy, and as long as this stays within the progressive bloc, that's a lot better than when it goes to a mainstream or radical right party, particularly given that the mainstream parties often already pander to the radical right. What is crucial, first and foremost, is that the German Greens do not do what the Austrian Greens do. Right? It's absolutely despicable that the Greens go into a government and by and large just say, okay, here, you have everything that has to do with immigration and integration. Right? I'm just going to give up on that. You can make your map of Islam in your country, and I'm just going to push through some small tinkle on the sides of your environmental policy. I think stand on it, but also you now go into a campaign where you by and large know you're going to govern with the CDU, CSU, right? So yes, make some big claims, but do not put yourself out there as the opposite of CDU, CSU, because that's going to disappoint everyone. Already think about the points that are important to you and on which you think that you can get CDU, CSU to work, which is actually things like agriculture and things like environment, right? Where they come much closer. Now, in terms of some of the other issues that might be more problematic, indicate that these are important to you, right? But don't set yourself up for failure, which is quite often what parties do these days, is that they're going to act as if the world is going to end if that other party wins, even though they know they're going to govern with that party afterwards, right? And then you feel your play. I think the Greens are going to lose to the Social Democrats. That's just how the world works, right? But you can manage that, and you can manage the expectations of the CDU, CSU by saying, okay, these are important things. Here I won't compromise on, and that has to be essential, right? And here I want to make big strides. And again, I think to a certain extent, the Greens have an advantage over the Social Democrats by having more leeway because they have less overlap with the radical right to lose there.
Catherine, let's look for one moment at France, because we also have a big election coming up there next year. If you look at the polls, it looks a little bit like that we could see a repetition of the 2016 race, a close race between Macron and Le Pen. From your perspective, do you think this is actually something Macron could hope for, because then he could hope to repeat his success from 2016? Or do you think he should actually try to get Le Pen down even before the second round? and enter into a race in the second round with someone else? What would be the likely, or what would be the outcome that is, let's say, beneficial for Macron here?
So I really don't know what Emmanuel Macron is doing in terms of elections right now. He will probably be up against Le Pen, and that's not because of his own strength necessarily. He's not very popular, actually, if you look in the polls. I mean, French presidents are not always that popular, but it's because of the weakness of other mainstream parties, the Parti Socialiste, the Républicains, who are not doing well at all. There's been some talk about different people, but they will not do that well. But what he's decided to do, I mean, very early in, I can't remember if it was early in the spring, where one of his ministers was in debate with Marine Le Pen. I mean, you had an idea of, well, actually, who belongs to Assemblée Nationale, who belongs to the far right party? Extremely, yeah. I mean, I would call it Islamophobe. I mean, remarks that I think are fitting for a party that's in power when you want to integrate parts of society. You can understand that there have been terrorist attacks, but there have been terrorist attacks in many countries across the world, and I don't think that gives, you know, a preface to do that. So I fear with Macron that I mean, for me as a party strategist, he needs to make sure that the left feels comfortable enough to vote for him in the second round. And I do not see him doing that right now.
Interesting. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I have one final question that I really have and need to ask to you both. So the final question is, if there would be one thing that you could give as an advice to progressive actors on how they can limit the influence of right-wing populism and nationalism in this decade, so in the 2020s, what would that be? Keshen, maybe you want to start.
Take a position and keep that position as much as you can, and also make sure, indeed, as Cas said, to then not talk about the things that you want to compromise on, but really choose your battles and not see, and that battle needs to be for, indeed, protecting liberal rights and liberal democracy.
Great, thanks a lot. Cas, what would be your advice?
Yeah, I agree very much on that. I mean, as I wrote in my piece, I think, first of all, we have to repoliticize politics. It has to be ideological again. Like, we have to recapture the agenda. On the basis of our own ideology, we should focus on the key issues for us, which are the environment, the housing, public health, things like that. And third, and I think this is more important than many progressive parties understand or accept, you have to reimagine Europe, because in the current European Union, a lot of progressive policies are not so straightforward, if not even possible, right? And so this is not saying that you need to be Eurosceptic, right? They have to accept that just as your own national discourse is no longer like hegemonically left, to put it very, very mildly, right? The EU as it is today is not progressive. And it is not furthering the progressive case. And the narrative around it is not helping. And a lot of the policies that I think are necessary require fundamental changes within the EU, which can be done and which are in line with the original ideas of the European Union.
Thank you very much to both of you. That was a fantastic debate. Thanks a lot. It was a great pleasure to have you on this panel, and we could have discussed of course much longer, but time is running out and we are on a strict schedule on this whole progressive governance summit. I can only make one last remark to our audience here. There's a feedback form and you're all invited to fill that out. The team will share the link to that feedback form in the chat, so you can look in the chat and find the link there and then give us our feedback on this session. Then I would like to say thank you once again to our great panelists, to the audience. Enjoy the rest of the Progressive Governance Summit over the next 2 days, and goodbye for now. Good evening and good afternoon wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.